Helping Developers Drink from a Champagne Flute and Not a Fire Hose When It Comes to Cloud Security by Tyson Garrett and Jason Nelson. I would do a sponsor shout out here, but Netflix just wanted to support the conference, so shout out to Netflix. With that, take it away.
Awesome. So firstly, just for the developers here who got excited and thought I'd be giving free champagne to everyone, I'm sorry that is not the case, but hopefully you'll get as much joy from this talk as you would a glass of champagne nonetheless. So before we get started, I just want to do some quick introductions. So we've got Jason.
How's it going? I'm Jason Nelson, Director of Cloud Security and Architecture at Citibank.
And I'm Tyson Garrett. I'm the CTO for Trust on Cloud. We provide threat modeling as a service for different cloud service providers. So the challenge we've got with security and when we want to start applying security for application is there's lots of information, which is better than no information, but we've got awesome cloud conferences such as this, researchers, some of which may be in this room, the vendor documentation, which may vary in its viewpoint, and REST API documentation as well, right? And then your own research you might be doing. And all you're trying to do is figure out, well, I'm trying to write an application with business logic and everything. I'm going to use the cloud. What do I actually need to do at the cloud level to make sure I'm actually secure? So hopefully most people here have heard of the concept of threat modeling. If you haven't, then you'll learn some more stuff about it today. But we're really going to go do a deep dive on what a cloud service threat model looks like and then how that can get into the hands of developers, like the outcomes of that research can get into their hands to be effective. So the whole concept here is I want to use a threat model to give me confidence as a business for using a service for an application. If I don't have the confidence that I've got the right controls in place, then I'm probably not going to put my business livelihood on the line to use that service. And there's ways of doing this, right? So typically we look at this as a service level. You're not going to threat model all of AWS. Like, why threat model ground station if you just use an S3? So the first thing you really want to think about here is how do I break it down to a specific service? But then within that service, what threats can I have? And then what controls can I have to address those threats? And then once we go further into a service, you want to start thinking about how can I actually control parts of that service? So an example here I'll use with SageMaker. SageMaker's got many components. Some of them are hosted models, training jobs, Jupyter notebooks. If I'm just using the hosted model part of a SageMaker, I can, and by doing IAM permissions, I'm not giving people create notebook instance, for example, or SageMaker : I can say then, okay, I'm really going to focus on the threats related to hosted models. And then once I'm looking at the threats for hosted models, I can then look at the controls I've got in place for that as well. And so then once you're in this tighter field place, and once you're looking at a particular feature class of a service, so here we're going down around a feature class of S3, we can start looking at specific threats for S3. And when you're looking at quantifying a threat, you want to look at different aspects of that. So obviously you want to figure out what the attack path might look like. So it's on the right there, we've got a data flow diagram, and that's going to help you as a researcher determine what controls you might want to put into place. Once you understand the data flow, you can then start thinking about the controls you can put into place. So you're already thinking of ideas at that point. And it's also, a picture says 1,000 words. So if you've got a developer who's like, why do I have to do this control? You can show them, well, here's the threat, here's the attack path as well. So it's not just lots of words they may not understand. You then want to look at things like, well, what's the MITRE attack technique, right? So in that way you can start putting that into other tooling within your organization. And the CVSS really helps. Like, how much should I really actually care about this threat? Is it like, yeah, it could be the end of the world, but it's very, very hard to do? Or this is so simple, I need no permission and it's just going to happen. And then finally, we want to look at things like what is the IAM permissions required to execute the threat. So then you can start thinking about when I'm giving people permissions or systems permissions, are they going to be able to execute this threat? And how can I control that access for that particular permission as well? And that might be a distinct permission or a set of permissions, depending on the specific attack. And then finally, once you've figured out those vectors, you start thinking about what does the controls look like? And you've got to have preventative controls, you've got to have detective controls ideally, but something people often forget about is directive controls, because we're not coding directive controls. Directive controls, think of them as mechanisms. So you're going to have a directive control about like maintaining an inventory of public S3, authorized public S3 buckets in your organization. So, instead of just saying, oh, it can't be public, because something's probably going to be public and it's going to be okay, what's the process you go through? Where do you publish that authorized list? So then when you get an alert about a new public S3 bucket, the poor SOC person is able to tell at 3 a.m, is it on the authorized list? And if it's not, I've got the agency to then lock it down. If there's no published list, they might go, Frank got in trouble last week when he shut something down. I'll punt it to the morning crew. And then you've got a publicly exposed bucket for 6 hours. And then finally, what you want to look at there is when you're defining these controls, you want to look at not only you want to look at the control in as much detail as possible. You don't want to say, ideally you don't want to be saying stuff like, secure buckets with access points, for example. You want to be really specific about how you're going to secure that bucket with an access point. Or you also want to sort of be descriptive of, look for this JSON field, or look for this property in this field of this JSON response. So you want to be very accurate. Think of that like as a user story, but very detailed and technical, so it's actually actionable. And then the other really important part is testing. You want to test your control. Depending on your organization, you may have other people testing your controls, and that's really important as well. Another thing to think of is what's the level of effort to implement the control, and what's the level of effectiveness of that control against a threat. Because those things are going to give you an idea of what's the return on the investment of me spending or developers spending time designing the control and implementing the control. If it's very low impact and very high effort, and the CVSS for the threat is low, should you really spend all that time on it versus one where it's a high level of threat, high impact, and low level of effort? So you think about like a return on the investment of controls. Threat modeling's hard. Implementing 1,000 controls, you could probably say, is harder. So you want to make sure you get that return on the investment. Then, once you've done it, you've got to stay up to date. So you need to think about things like, how am I going to stay up to date? And the reason for that is when SageMaker got launched, for example, there were 29 APIs. There's 142 now. If you assess a service at a point in time, the service doesn't stop. You've just stopped analysing it. You need to continuously analyse the services. Another example of why, even if they haven't introduced a new API, cloud providers update their APIs. So last year, access points gave you the ability to go cross-account. There was no new API, no new permission, just an additional property value you could set on an API. So all of a sudden your boundary, when you analyse something, it's now changed. So you need to stay up to date. Ways of staying up to date, you've got the CSP. They'll provide Bodo 3, permission lists, etc. You need to monitor both. An API does not equal permission. Not all APIs are published, as we saw yesterday as well. There's also third-party websites here. Some of these have RSS feeds, some of these have GitHub. These are all worthwhile things to track if you want to keep across exactly how the cloud provider is changing things. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jason to talk about how we then go on to distill that information.
Good morning. Thank you for sticking around to attend these conference talks. And I'm not sure how many people are going to move over to reinforce after this, but I appreciate you being here now. A lot of what he just covered is kind of the value and really what is offered by Trust on Cloud. I'm coming from the customer's perspective and building a threat modeling program and integrating with the developers and that whole shift left mentality. So some of these slides, they're going to have a lot of things on there. I'm not going to read them off and speak to them, you will have this video, might be able to download the deck, so that can be used later, or take the photos, as I see a lot of you doing. What I really want you to take away from the next several slides, the next few minutes I'm speaking, is how do I adopt this? What is the purpose of this information? And then how do I move more quickly to having secure workloads in the cloud for my business? So as this is going to start going through is, what do I need to do? The methodology, security teams, engagement, things like that. A lot of what I've been doing is designing that process, the handoffs between teams. I work at a very large global bank. So as you could imagine, there's a lot of process and requirement. Smaller firms don't need that much process and requirement because they're not regulated, but you still want secure design. So this is why you need to define how you're going to review each technology bit. And as you start to do that, you realize there's a fair amount of work. And so consuming content like this accelerates your research, provides you contextualized information about the services so that I can go straight into my Jira workflow and tickets. So I could put together an architecture and say, here's where my threats exist, here's the things I need to build in my backlog before I do my deployment, or have a roadmap into ramping up to the security posture I need to be at. The details around these are going to be things that you're going to figure out along the way, because as you become more mature or as you have process inefficiencies, these things are going to help you overcome those things. We all know what the shared services model. Anybody not know what the shared services model is for cloud? All right, we're in the right.
It's your fault. That's your responsibility. You're responsible for nothing. You're responsible for screwing it up.
Exactly, for the most part. A lot of this is diving in deep enough to understand where the CSP is not being entirely forthcoming. You will discover their documentation is inaccurate or not complete, or sometimes doesn't even document legacy APIs that are still active in the service. This is why you can decide the level of effort you're going to put into your program and build it. So this whole slide is, you need to find your comfort level of how much work is necessary to deploy something. This information that we consume from Trust on Cloud enables me to have a greater context so I can move forward more rapidly in lower level environments. I then deploy my threat modeling team and process that we've built to kind of go the next mile for our regulatory requirements and for our deep security reviews, and then flow those threats into other teams like our security engineering teams that build the controls, test for efficacy. That flows into SOC, where SOC then evaluates it, builds their playbooks, runbooks, tests for signal to noise, and things like that. And then finally, that's when it's done, and our consumers, lines of business, developers, things like that, can actually deploy. So from a high level perspective, that's kind of what a large environment, that's what the process looks like. And again, the information of how you deep dive into these services and having a well-defined process for consistent, repeatable process is key to that. And right now, when we start going into who your customers are and things like that, this is just more of just knowing what your process is. So again, these slides are going to help guide you through, if you're not already familiar or have a level of maturity in threat modeling, these will kind of help you through the steps to do that. The program in the security engineering, that's I think the key, because I've done this at a couple other different places, and the real thing that moved us forward and made a big change in how effective we were in the organization is changing from being a security department that does research and says, look at all the bad things. And we turn it from generating reports and reporting that to different organizations to creating JIRA tickets and flowing into the engineering teams. So instead of stuff going into risk acceptance or risk acknowledgement or action plans, which defers the threats and the controls from being implemented, they go straight in engineering and get done early. So I think that's what I want you to take away from a lot of this is consider how your environment works, and if you can restructure to align towards your engineering teams, that's going to add the most value in your threat modeling program. Because if you, at the end of the day, want to say, I've identified this many things and that's your metric, unless you're a vendor that reports on newfound threats, that's a bad metric. The metric needs to be, how many things did I get implemented and I bent the risk curve in the right direction? Because that is really why threat modeling exists and why a lot of us are working on security and concerned about security. So that's what I want you to take about this. The data flow diagrams and other things like that, you will find your level there. Does anybody do DFDs today? So I appreciate any questions or comments you have about that, because we find we can take content from Trust on Cloud, or we build our own as well, but to what level is necessary? Because a lot of developers, when they're pushing through workloads or requests, I'm getting stick figures. And I'm doing this, it goes there, that's the internet, that's the cloud, this is my thing. That's good enough from a, hey, I've had an idea. But when you are getting down to identifying threats, you need to identify API actions, endpoints, context of trust boundaries, things like that. So all of those things, if they're not already familiar to you, will be very, very helpful for you to have a common vernacular amongst all your teams and a common way to produce your artifacts. Loopback process. This is also key. This is a maturity thing though. So after you've built your program, integrate with your engineering teams, integrate with your SOC, integrate with your VA, integrate with your business, because essentially early on, once we discover a threat, it goes to our VA team and they give us feedback. So if it's real, path to execution, or hey, that was a nice pipe dream that didn't go anywhere. SOC, your controls and your detective controls that you're writing, they're so noisy. Like, it's so difficult to actually action on this without a major research. So that feedback is helpful so we can tighten the way we write our controls. The engineering teams, we cannot actually build a control for this without spending hundreds of hours of time, creating new infrastructure to monitor for this. So that's what I want you to take away from this slide, essentially. But that's a high maturity state. So again, use these slides on your journey as you're creating threat modeling programs. This is kind of covering some of those things. The compliance and incident response I didn't cover. Compliance again, and I know we're just over, so I'll be real quick on this one. Threat modeling is not a compliance exercise. I hope everybody agrees with that statement, but I know at large regulated industry, compliance is integral to everything. So we integrate there and have created a process so that they can validate our work as a governance process to ensure that it can and is effective and meets the frameworks that we have to demonstrate for. Incident response. This is something, again, when our IR team performs actions, tabletop exercises or other types of functions, they may discover new novel approaches to how the threat could have been executed, or just brand new threats. So build that integration point, because everybody learns as long as you're sharing. So that is, I think, that's it.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Any questions? Don't be shy.
Questions in the room?
So what advice do you have for smaller organizations that don't have a whole team to do threat modeling, but these services are getting built into core parts of the company or parts of the infrastructure? It's like, hey, how do you balance that level of like, we need to use this, but also we don't know the whole enumeration of the services and the APIs that could be risky?
I'd say like the advantage a smaller organization has is, well, hopefully you have less applications, right? Like these large organizations have got thousands, if not tens of thousands of apps. So you still, if you think about it, right, from a development perspective, you really do want to understand what func calls you're making from the applications, etc. I'd say then what you want to do is you want to look at the fundamentals of IAM or identity permission is the new boundary, right? So am I restricting IAM permissions, and how am I setting my security boundaries appropriately? Like we open source some of our threat models. So we've got Google, BigQuery, Azure Storage, S3. So you can look at those and go, okay, that gives me some ideas of the approaches to take. And you look at our control prioritization. That will give you an idea of, okay, identity security is really important. Endpoints are important. Logging obviously helps. But you also need to think about really you need to be able to do that, as Jason described, that data flow diagram for your application really tightly. Because that will actually give you a really good concept of what the threats may be. I think that's really important, is understanding your application.
There's one thing to add to that. From a low maturity start, any threat modeling is good. So if you're putting attention towards it, you're doing better than doing nothing. As you notice between team to team as they perform the action, there's variance and depth or other things like that. The artifacts they produce are different, and you need to normalize that. That's when you need to start defining your process and getting a little bit further down the maturity curve. So I hope that helps. But I mean, literally the content here, the content online, just reading all the documentation and saying, what are the things I need to consider? Like, do I need to protect this data, or is this the lunch menu? I don't really care. Just that effort alone would take a lot of people further than where they are today.
So I just had more an open-ended question, right? So what I'm seeing, the whole threat modeling, security assessments in the past 5 to 6 years has gone through a lot of changes, and now it's become to a level where it is very redundant, and it's more a checklist kind of process, right? Like the kind of questions, the kind of stuff.
Oh, no, I'd say, look, it comes down, if you're threat modeling the cloud service providers side of the shared responsibility model, so like, are they ISO compliant, PCI, etc. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty much a checklist exercise. You're not going to get AWS to change their password policy that a service team uses. This is the threat modeling of the side of the customer side of the shared responsibility model, right? So this is, in the cloud layer is this part of your application stack, right? So you've got to, businesses need to be threat modeling not only how they're using the cloud, but you need to be threat modeling how you're using your application. What's the business logic I've got in there? How can these things be abused? And by threat modeling what you're using, that really narrows your scope down to truly understanding what it is. And like I'd say, look, the fact that the cloud services are changing at a rate of like 20 to 30% per year is we need to keep on thinking about how do these things change my thing? Like, if I'm using an API today and they change part of that API, I can now go cross account, then that's a continual exercise we need to do.
Yeah, I think I was asking more from a customer side, because we are seeing a standard repetitive activity that we are looking to automate. Because as the company grows, the number of services, the number of things that we adopt, the security assessment or the threat modeling team cannot linearly keep increasing.
We provided as a service for that reason, right? Because it's hard, right? But it's then narrowing down what you look at, I'd say.
Hey guys, a great talk, by the way. I think my question is more around just focus of the overall like threat modeling process. What is some, like, from an organizational standpoint, do you guys have any stories that you can share on certain processes that people often overlook for threat modeling? That's something I just want to see, and how can we kind of prevent people from overlooking things when it comes to threat modeling?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's kind of getting towards the maturity of your program. So, and I'll be quick because I know the next talker's coming in. So, when you're doing this, you're going to start identifying things, and you're going to start building your backlog, and that's going to get in the way. And then you, as I said, you integrate with the other teams, and Bringing in engineering is a really big thing. Integrating with your other VA, SOC, IR teams and compliance are really going to be important. The things people start to overlook is the overall intake process. It's the handoffs that always slow down process. And so if there's not awareness of where the handoffs are, things get lost in queue, things get not informed properly. So you really have to take ownership of your process and run it like you're running a service to other customers. So reach out to the front end of your process where, like for us, our line of business makes a request and it goes into a whole nother organization. It goes through a bunch of process and then ends up at us. So we have taken it upon ourselves to integrate ourselves, inject ourselves into those processes to shape what the content is collected, the output of those processes, so that when it comes to us, it's actually well formed. Because that slows down a lot of stuff. If someone hands you a stick drawing, you need to go back to them and say, no, I actually need to know what this does. And that can go on back and forth for many, many months. So if you assert yourself, affect the change in those processes, that's probably the biggest thing I can share right now in the time that we have.
Maybe another quick one. I'll pick this one from Slack. How do you approach service level threat modeling without the specific context of a deployment or a use case, i.e. understanding the specific assets or threat actors for the business?
Yeah, so I guess this is where we've got this handoff of we look at the intrinsic threats and we look at it, we try and narrow it down to that API/permission level of where it comes into, and then we'll give the raw, think of it like a raw CVSS, but then you've got the context of, is it the lunch menu or is it online banking, right? And that's where that context comes into play. But you've got things like data classification levels and such as that, where you need to know what services and what parts of the services your critical apps are using versus the lunch menu apps. And I think that helps you focus where you're going to then apply the controls.
And then you mentioned, sorry, did you?
Real quick on that. Again, consuming this content has enabled us to, as a very large global organization, move into our lowest level environment within about 2 weeks. So I know some small companies that can't move that fast. The point of this is it tells you the context of the controls, and if you can actually build enough guardrails in your environment, then someone says, I need to use this brand new service, you can take this content, rapidly engineer the base level controls that you need, not everything, just to do a POC. That is kind of, I think, where that is going. Like, how do you wrap it into the gentleman here in the front of the blue cap? That's kind of an answer to your question. How do you make it repeatable and how do you scale? You need to find a way to consume information, build a base level of controls and define what that is in your process. So I can allow you to POC whatever the hell you want in this environment with just these controls. But you want to move into higher level environments, you need these level controls and these level controls and be able to demonstrate efficacy. You know what I mean? So that.
Yep.
Was a lot of questions, so we'll do a quick turnaround to the next talk, and thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.